In late 2018, a Midwestern soybean farmer watched his harvest pile up unsold. China, once his biggest customer, has stopped buying. Thousands of miles away in Shenzhen, a factory manager holds emergency meetings as U.S. orders for electronics dry up. American shoppers, meanwhile, begin to notice higher prices on everyday goods. What's happening? The world's two largest economies are locked in a tariff tit-for-tat. This is the U.S.-China trade war, and while it erupted publicly in 2018, its roots run far deeper. To understand how we got here, let's go back in time. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. The economic friction between America and China goes back centuries, long before today's headlines. In 1784, an American ship named the Empress of China sailed to Canton, inaugurating direct U.S.-China trade. Early Americans hungered for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China, self-sufficient and wealthy, had little need for American goods. The result? A one-sided exchange. Silver bullion from the United States flowed into China to pay for coveted Chinese products. In fact, Americans ran a trade deficit from the very beginning, as one historian noted, buying far more from China than they sold. This imbalance did not go unnoticed. By the mid-19th century, Western powers resorted to force to open China's markets. The British victory in the First Opium War in 1839 to 1842 compelled China to accept imports and foreign trade on Western terms. The United States, though not a combatant, quickly demanded the same privileges, signing the Treaty of Wangxia in 1844 to gain equal access. These unequal treaties symbolized an era when foreign powers dictated trade in China. Throughout the 1800s, U.S. merchants eagerly traded in treaty ports like Shanghai and Canton. But despite growing commerce, the pattern persisted. Americans imported tea, spices, and silk, exporting relatively little that China wanted. The seeds of tension were already present in this lopsided relationship, a dynamic of American consumers versus Chinese producers that would echo in later centuries. Fast forward to the early 20th century, after decades of foreign exploitation, China was weak and impoverished. Trade with the U.S. continued in fits and starts. During World War II, the U.S. aided China against Japan, but after the Communist Revolution in 1949, all bets were off. Mao Zedong's New People's Republic of China was isolated by U.S. policy. Virtually no trade flowed between 1950 and the early 1970s as Cold War hostility cut ties. It wasn't until 1972, when President Richard Nixon made his historic visit to Beijing, that the ice began to thaw. Nixon's trip paved the way for formal diplomatic relations and renewed commerce. By 1979, the United States and Communist China officially established ties, and Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping, the architect of China's economic reforms, even toured America that year, famously donning a cowboy hat at a Texas rodeo. This moment symbolized a new beginning. Both nations hoped that trade could serve as a bridge, turning old adversaries into economic partners. The late 1970s and 1980s marked a phase of optimism. China, under Deng, launched its policy of reform and opening up, inviting foreign investment and liberalizing its economy. The United States eagerly welcomed China into the global trading system, seeing economic engagement as a tool for peace and development. Trade was initially modest. In 1980, two-way U.S.-China trade was only around $5 billion. American businesses were just beginning to explore China's market, and Chinese factories were far from the export powerhouses they'd later become. Still, the foundation was set. Throughout the 1980s, commerce grew. China exported simple goods like textiles, apparel, and toys, while importing American machinery, grain, and technology. Though small in scale, trade was growing at double-digit rates. Political winds intervened at times, notably the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989, after which the U.S. briefly cooled relations and imposed sanctions. But by the early 1990s, engagement was back on track under a policy U.S. leaders dubbed constructive engagement. A pivotal shift came in the 1990s. As the Cold War ended, China's economy accelerated and its exports exploded. American retailers discovered a cheap sourcing paradise in China's vast labor force. Walmart, for example, began importing ever larger volumes of Chinese-made consumer goods. Annual bilateral trade jumped from just $5 billion in 1980 to over $231 billion by 2004, an astounding increase. By 2006, China had surged to become America's second largest trading partner after Canada. Container ships laden with electronics, appliances, and clothing crisscrossed the Pacific, bringing U.S. consumers affordable products and fueling China's export-led boom. But beneath the prosperity, frictions sharpened. American manufacturers and their workers began to feel the squeeze of Chinese competition. Factory after factory in the U.S., Midwest and South closed or moved overseas, unable to match China's low production costs. Economists later quantified that after China entered the global market, especially post-2001, imports from China contributed to a sharp drop in U.S. manufacturing jobs, a phenomenon now dubbed the China shock. Indeed, after China joined the World Trade Organization, the decline in American factory employment accelerated. One study estimated that the widening U.S.-China trade deficit cost 2.7 million American jobs from 2001 to 2011, particularly in industries like furniture, textiles, and electronics assembly. American policy was slow to react at first. In 1994, U.S. officials had quietly flagged China's currency practices. Beijing kept its renminbi tightly pegged at a low value, making Chinese exports artificially cheap. There were accusations that China was a currency manipulator, though no formal punitive action was taken at that time. Meanwhile, concerns grew about intellectual property, IP theft. American software, music, and Hollywood films were being pirated en masse in China's streets, and U.S. companies complained of brazen copying of their products. Intellectual property disputes flared in the mid-1990s. In 1995, the U.S. threatened trade sanctions over rampant piracy of CDs and videos, leading China to strike a last-minute agreement to crack down on counterfeiters. Despite these tensions, Washington's overall strategy in the 1990s was to integrate China, not isolate it. The logic was that bringing China into global institutions would encourage it to play by international rules. The climax of this approach was China's entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO. In October 2000, President Bill Clinton won congressional approval for the U.S.-China Relations Act, granting Beijing Permanent Normal Trade Relations, PNTR, status. This cleared the way for China to join the WTO in 2001, binding it to global trade rules. U.S. leaders hoped WTO membership would make China liberalize its economy, open its markets to American goods, and commit to fair trade practices. With the stroke of a pen, China was welcomed into the rules-based trading club, and U.S. corporations eagerly anticipated access to 1.3 billion new consumers. The immediate effect was an explosion of trade. After China's WTO entry in 2001, U.S.-China commerce accelerated rapidly. Big box stores in the United States brimmed with inexpensive Chinese-made goods, from electronics to housewares, bringing lower prices for American families and fatter profit margins for U.S. importers. U.S. exports to China also grew, especially raw materials, agricultural products, and specialized machinery, but not nearly as fast as imports. The U.S. consistently imported far more from China than it exported. By 2017, the U.S. trade deficit with China in goods had ballooned to roughly $375 billion. This gap, the excess of imports over exports became a glaring statistic cited by American politicians as shorthand for an unfair relationship. Economists, however, note that macroeconomic forces like national savings rates drive such imbalances. Americans spend more than they save, while the Chinese save a lot, fueling export surpluses. In other words, the deficit has causes beyond trade policy. Entering the 2000s, frictions that had been building under the surface started to erupt into open disputes. While trade was booming, each side began voicing grievances. U.S. officials accused China of a litany of unfair practices, keeping its currency undervalued, subsidizing state-owned companies, stealing intellectual property, forcing American firms to hand over technology as the price of market access, and flooding world markets with underpriced exports. For its part, China countered that it was still a developing country playing catch-up, and that U.S. complaints were attempts to contain China's rise. Beijing often pointed out that American consumers and companies were benefiting enormously from cheap Chinese goods and manufacturing, a point supported by the low inflation and high corporate profits of that era. Despite the mutual dependence, by the mid-2000s, the U.S. government felt compelled to act on some of these disputes. President George W. Bush's administration, from 2001 to 2009, began using trade law tools to curb certain Chinese imports. For example, to protect the struggling U.S. textile and clothing industry, which faced a surge of Chinese apparel after global quotas ended, Bush imposed quotas on Chinese textile imports in 2005. The U.S. alleged that Chinese textiles were dumped at unfairly low prices and harming domestic mills. China, in turn, criticized these moves but often negotiated voluntary export restraints to calm the waters. Another issue was Chinese subsidies and excess capacity in industries like steel. By the late 2000s, China's steel mills, many state-backed, were churning out far more steel than the world could absorb, driving prices down. The Obama administration, from 2009 to 2017, responded by launching WTO cases and anti-dumping investigations into Chinese steel and aluminum subsidies. In 2012, for instance, the U.S. joined the EU and Japan in formally challenging China's export restrictions on rare earth metals, vital minerals for high-tech manufacturing, arguing that China's quotas violated trade rules. Each time China denied wrongdoing, but sometimes adjusted policies or lost in WTO arbitration. These mini conflicts were precursors to the larger war to come. One instructive episode came in 2009. American labor unions and tire manufacturers petitioned President Barack Obama for relief, claiming surging Chinese tire imports were putting U.S. tire factories out of business. Obama agreed, invoking a special safeguard provision from China's WTO accession terms to impose a 35% tariff on Chinese car and light truck tires for 3 years, from 2009 to 2012. Beijing was furious. In retaliation, China quickly slapped its own tariffs on U.S. exports of chicken parts, a key export to China. This was effectively a localized trade war. Tariffs volleyed back and forth in the specific sectors of tires and chickens. The results were mixed and illuminating. U.S. tire makers did see temporary relief. President Obama noted in 2012 that domestic tire production and jobs had ticked up, crediting the tariffs for saving around 1,200 American tire jobs. But the broader consequences were less rosy. With less competition, U.S. tire companies raised prices, making tires about 3% more expensive on average. American consumers paid that cost, spending more on tires, leaving less disposable income for other goods. In China's counterstrike, American poultry exporters lost an estimated $1 billion in sales as their second largest market vanished. And while Chinese tire imports to the U.S. did drop, other countries like South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia simply filled the gap. Within a couple of years, U.S. tire imports from those countries rose sharply as importers shifted sourcing. In the end, a study by the Peterson Institute found the tire tariffs cost U.S. consumers more in higher prices than they saved in jobs, even counting the jobs directly protected. It was a sobering lesson. Even well-intentioned trade barriers had unintended ripple effects. Other clashes simmered during the Obama years. In 2010 to 2011, with U.S. unemployment high after the Great Recession, criticism of China's currency policy grew louder. Congress debated legislation to punish China for currency manipulation. Although that specific label was avoided, pressure mounted on Beijing, which did gradually allow the yuan to rise a bit in value. Meanwhile, China's indigenous technology ambitions alarmed U.S. officials. Beijing rolled out plans like Made in China 2025, aiming to dominate cutting-edge industries from AI to electric cars. The U.S. business community, once China's biggest advocate, grew wary as market access in China remained tough. American tech and media companies faced restrictions, and joint venture rules forced technology sharing. By the mid-2010s, talk of China not playing fair on trade was common in Washington. Yet for all the disputes, the overarching theme before 2017 was dialogue and containment. U.S. presidents mostly pursued incremental negotiations with China, pressing for better behavior through diplomatic channels or WTO litigation, but without rocking the boat via sweeping tariffs. Trade expanded through these years despite the scuffles. By 2015-2016, China had become the top trading partner for over 100 countries worldwide, a pillar of the global economy, and U.S.-China trade in goods exceeded $600 billion annually. Still, American public opinion was shifting. Factories had closed across the Midwest. Studies linked import competition from China to pronounced job losses and even social troubles in those regions. Both Democrats and Republicans began questioning the old engagement strategy. Was China playing by the rules or taking advantage of them? All these long-brewing grievances came to a head in 2018. A new U.S. President, Donald Trump, had been elected after campaigning that trade with China was a disaster for America. He vowed to bring back manufacturing jobs and get tough on what he termed China's economic abuses. Upon taking office, President Trump wasted little time. In March 2018, he invoked an obscure Cold War-era law, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum imports worldwide, including Chinese metal, citing national security. It was a shot across the bow. But the real salvo came soon after. Following an investigation under Section 301 of U.S. trade law, the Trump administration charged China with widespread theft of intellectual property, forced technology transfer, and unfair trade practices. As remedy, Trump announced sweeping tariffs on at least $50 billion worth of Chinese products in April 2018. Beijing's reaction was swift and pointed. China's leaders denied the U.S. allegations, arguing that China had earned its success through hard work and that American consumers benefited from the low-priced goods. Still, they could not let Trump's tariffs go unanswered. By early April 2018, China retaliated with its own tariff list on American exports, targeting politically sensitive goods like soybeans, pork, and airplanes. The stage was set for an escalating cycle of tit-for-tat. In July 2018, the trade skirmish became a full-fledged trade war. The U.S. implemented a 25% import tax on $34 billion of Chinese goods, from industrial machinery to electronics. China immediately matched the move with 25% tariffs on $34 billion of U.S. exports, hitting American farmers particularly hard by including commodities such as beef, dairy, and soybeans. Indeed, China's tariff list read like a map of Trump country. It zeroed in on agricultural and industrial products produced in states that supported President Trump, a strategic choice to exert maximum political pressure. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office, for its part, kept expanding the tariff lists. By September 2018, the U.S. had placed tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports, and by 2019, that sum grew to over $360 billion in affected goods. Virtually half of everything China sold to the U.S. was now subject to extra duty, an astonishing reversal after decades of ever-freer trade. China, unable to match dollar for dollar due to the imbalance in trade volumes, nonetheless imposed tariffs on about $110 billion of U.S. exports, covering most American goods shipped to China. Both sides dug in. President Trump and his advisors argued that this pain was necessary to force Beijing's hand. They believed the U.S. had more leverage in this showdown. After all, China sold far more to America than vice versa, and Chinese firms would be hit harder in absolute terms. Trade wars are good and easy to win, Trump tweeted. U.S. officials insisted China must fundamentally change practices, end IP theft and cyber espionage, stop forcing U.S. companies to partner with local firms, and curtail massive subsidies to high-tech industries. China is ripping us off, Trump said bluntly, justifying the tariffs. At the same time, the administration offered a vision of rebalance. They wanted China to buy much more from the U.S. to reduce the trade deficit and to play fair by international norms. After China joined the WTO in 2001, U.S.-China trade surged, jumping from just $5 billion in 1980 to $231 billion by 2004. This boom brought cheaper goods to America, but also led to factory closures and job losses in the U.S., sowing seeds of discontent. Beijing's perspective was starkly different. Chinese leaders framed Trump's onslaught as hegemonic bullying designed to thwart China's rise. State media decried U.S. tariffs as trade bullying and painted China as the reluctant defender in a conflict it didn't seek. Privately, officials in Beijing were surprised by the scale of Trump's actions. Previous U.S. presidents had saber-rattled but ultimately avoided all-out economic confrontation. Finding themselves in a trade war, the Chinese adopted a mix of retaliation and outreach. They levied tariffs on U.S. soybeans, prompting an outcry from American farmers. China had been the largest buyer of U.S. soy, and suddenly that market evaporated. In response, Washington had to extend multi-billion-dollar aid packages, about $28 billion, to U.S. farmers to offset their losses. China also taxed American-made autos, grains, and machinery, making those products pricier for Chinese buyers and squeezing U.S. companies. At the same time, Chinese diplomats kept negotiating, looking for an off-ramp. Both sides engaged in on-again, off-again talks through 2018 and 2019. There were moments of truce. For instance, a meeting between Trump and President Xi Jinping in December 2018 yielded a temporary halt on new tariffs. But fundamental differences remained. The U.S. wanted structural changes that struck at core facets of China's economic model, like curbing support for state enterprises and more transparency in industrial policy, which Beijing was loath to agree to. China offered to buy more American products and open some markets, but resisted any binding commitment to alter its state-directed economic practices. Meanwhile, the economic pain on both sides began to mount. In the U.S., import tariffs are effectively a tax paid by importers and often passed to consumers. Despite the White House's claims that China was paying, studies showed American companies and consumers bore about 90% of the tariff costs via higher prices. Certain sectors were hit particularly hard. Farmers lost market share and watched commodity prices drop. Manufacturers reliant on Chinese components faced rising input costs, squeezing their profit margins. Some U.S. firms delayed investments due to uncertainty or shifted supply chains to other Asian countries to avoid tariffs. By 2019, U.S. economic growth had slowed slightly, and the manufacturing sector dipped into a mild recession, in part due to trade uncertainties. China's economy also felt the strain. Export growth sputtered, factories in export-reliant provinces saw layoffs. China's GDP growth slipped to its lowest rate in nearly 30 years by 2019. However, the damage was moderated by China's own stimulus measures and the fact that its vast domestic market was becoming a bigger growth driver. Moreover, Chinese exporters began adjusting. Some lowered prices, eating the cost of tariffs to stay competitive. Others found alternative buyers in Europe or Asia. In a globalized twist, some Chinese goods were rerouted. For example, Chinese-made components might ship to Vietnam, get assembled into a product, and then exported to the U.S. tariff-free under a different label. Such evasion strategies meant the U.S. didn't necessarily reduce its trade reliance on China as much as headline numbers might suggest. Throughout 2019, the tit-for-tat continued. Notably, in August 2019, the U.S. Treasury officially labeled China a currency manipulator for the first time since 1994. A largely symbolic rebuke, quickly dropped the next year, but signifying how frayed relations had become. By the fall of 2019, both governments were looking for a way to pause the hostilities. The toll on the global economy, from sinking business confidence to roller coaster stock markets, was becoming worrisome. In January 2020, after nearly 2 years of economic conflict, Washington and Beijing reached a limited ceasefire known as the Phase 1 trade deal. With great fanfare, President Trump and China's Vice Premier Liu, he signed the agreement at the White House on January 15, 2020. In this deal, China agreed to substantially increase its purchases of U.S. goods and services by an estimated $200 billion over 2020-2021, including agricultural products like soybeans and pork. It also made commitments to strengthen intellectual property protection and curb the forced transfer of technology from foreign firms. The U.S., in return, canceled some planned tariffs and slightly reduced existing tariffs on about $120 billion in Chinese goods. Crucially, however, most tariffs remained in place. Even after Phase 1, the average U.S. tariff on Chinese imports was around 19%, up from 3% before the trade war, a stark new normal. China likewise maintained elevated tariffs on a host of American imports. The toughest issues were essentially kicked down the road. The agreement said nothing about China's pervasive subsidies to state companies, its broader industrial strategies, or U.S. concerns over cybersecurity and digital trade. In essence, Phase 1 was a truce, not a comprehensive peace treaty. It halted escalation and provided some relief to farmers. China did resume large purchases of U.S. farm goods in 2020 as promised, but it didn't roll back the bulk of the trade barriers that had arisen. Not 2 months later, an unforeseen event would sideline trade talks, the COVID-19 pandemic. As the virus spread globally in early 2020, U.S.-China relations took another hit. Mutual recriminations over the handling of the pandemic and other geopolitical tensions, Hong Kong, technology sanctions, human rights issues in Xinjiang, further soured the atmosphere. The trade deal's purchase targets became hard to meet amid economic disruptions. By the end of 2021, independent analyses found China had fulfilled only around 60% of its promised U.S. goods purchases, despite a strong rebound in trade flows. Still, neither side scrapped the deal. It simply drifted, incomplete. As of today, the trade war remains in effect in many ways. When President Joe Biden took office in 2021, he chose to keep most of Trump's tariffs in place. Biden's administration argues that the tariffs give the U.S. leverage and that China has not corrected the practices at issue. In fact, the U.S. has doubled down on some areas, for example, imposing strict export controls on advanced technology like semiconductor chips and equipment to prevent Chinese companies from obtaining cutting-edge tech with military or surveillance applications. China, for its part, has responded with its own export controls on certain materials and continued to promote self-sufficiency in tech. The trade war has thus evolved into a broader economic rivalry, encompassing not just tariffs, but investment bans, sanctions, and competition over whose tech standards will prevail. What has been the legacy of this years-long trade confrontation? In pure trade terms, the nations remain deeply interconnected. In 2022, U.S.-China goods trade actually hit a record high, tariff walls notwithstanding. American consumers still buy hundreds of billions worth of Chinese-made products annually, and U.S. companies, from Apple growers to microchip designers, still count on access to China's market. However, the composition of trade has shifted at the margins. Some manufacturing has diversified to other countries in Asia, and Chinese firms have started sourcing certain high-tech inputs from non-U.S. suppliers where possible. Strategically, both countries speak of de-risking or reducing reliance. The U.S. wants to secure supply chains for critical items like pharmaceuticals, batteries, and China wants to be less dependent on American technology. This partial unwinding of integration is often termed decoupling, yet complete decoupling would be enormously costly and, in the eyes of most experts, nearly impossible. The two economies are the world's largest, accounting for over 40% of global GDP combined. Their supply chains are so entwined that untangling them could take decades if it ever succeeds. For example, an iPhone embodies this interdependence. Designed in California using chips from Texas and software from Seattle, but assembled in China with components from across East Asia. Who wins or loses in such a scenario is not straightforward. As Chinese officials have repeatedly noted during the conflict, there are no winners in a trade war, meaning both sides ultimately bear costs. Indeed, by 2019, studies confirmed that the tariffs acted as a tax on U.S. consumers and caused significant disruptions without achieving a major reshoring of jobs. Chinese exporters lost some U.S. sales, but often found workarounds, while American farmers and companies suffered lost markets and higher input prices. Perhaps the most significant legacy is psychological and strategic. The trade war shattered the assumption that ever closer economic ties would inevitably bring U.S. and China closer politically. Instead, despite billions of dollars in daily trade, the two powers are openly at odds, a reality that has dawned on businesses and governments worldwide. Companies are now factoring in geopolitical risk, not just cost, when choosing where to locate factories. Policymakers are revisiting industrial policies, talking about resilience and national security in economic terms. In both Washington and Beijing, voices calling for a tougher stance on the other have grown louder, and yet history provides perspective. The U.S. and China have traversed a long and winding road from the Canton trade of the 18th century to the high-tech competition of today. Economic conflict between them is not new. It has waxed and waned across eras. There were the imbalances of the Qing dynasty, the isolation after 1949, the uneasy partnership of the early WTO years, and the recent dramatic showdown. As we look to the future, one thing is clear. The U.S.-China trade war, in whatever form it continues, is part of a much larger historical narrative. It is not an isolated tantrum of one presidency or one moment. Rather, it's the latest chapter in a story of two nations perpetually seeking equilibrium in their economic relationship. Today, the terms decoupling and strategic rivalry are in vogue, but interdependence still runs deep. The challenge for both Beijing and Washington is finding a balance between competition and cooperation. In the quiet hope of many observers, the two powers will remember that despite episodes of conflict, their fortunes have long been linked. After all, even as tariffs flew, Chinese and American scientists were co-developing life-saving medicines. Students were studying abroad in each other's universities, and consumers on both sides were enjoying the fruits and gadgets of the other's labor. The trade war has tested this relationship severely, but it hasn't severed it. Reflecting on history, one might conclude that outright economic divorce is unlikely. Instead, the U.S. and China will remain somewhat uneasy partners, learning, hopefully, to manage competition without letting it spiral out of control. The trade war of recent years is a stark reminder of how much the relationship has deteriorated, but also of how much both nations stand to lose if it continues indefinitely. As of 2025, talks of new truces and frameworks are cautiously emerging, suggesting that pragmatism may yet regain some ground. In the end, the U.S.-China trade war is indeed older than you think, rooted in historical patterns of trade and power, and its resolution, or at least mitigation, may lie in each side learning lessons from that history. The cause was decades, even centuries in the making. The consequences have been painful and far-reaching, and the legacy will shape global economics for years to come. For two nations so economically entwined, finding a way to coexist and trade on fair terms is not just desirable, it may be the only viable path forward. The story continues to unfold, but armed with an appreciation of the past, we can better understand the present standoff and why solving it requires more than quick fixes or punitive tariffs. It requires navigating a relationship as complex as any in modern history, one that has swung from partnership to rivalry, but that ultimately must find a new balance. History, after all, has tied the United States and China together in commerce since that first American ship to Canton in 1784, and it suggests that even amidst conflict, cooperation cannot be entirely cast aside. Like, share, and subscribe for more videos like this.